That day in the kitchen was one of the craziest but most exciting moments of my life, thanks to my stepsister Isabel. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, and the house was quiet, eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. I had been home alone for most of the day, mindlessly flipping through channels on the TV, trying to pass the time while my dad and his wife, Victoria, were out for the day running errands or doing whatever it was they did when our relationship had always been cordial but distant. We lived under the same roof, exchanging polite greetings, but that was the extent of it. But lately something had shifted over the last few weeks. I had noticed Isabel looking at me differently. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the way her eyes lingered on me for just a moment too long, the way she seemed to find excuses to be near me in the same room, sitting just a little too close. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing at all. Through the windows, I was trying to ignore the strange energy that seemed to hang in the air whenever Izzy was around. She had been in her room all day, or so I thought, but when I heard footsteps behind me, I knew she was about to make her presence known. "Hey," Isabel's voice broke the silence as she stepped into the kitchen. I looked up from my phone and saw her standing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest. She looked relaxed, but there was something in her eyes that I knew was why I came down. I felt my stomach tighten at her comments, but I wasn't completely sure why. There was something unusual about the way she looked at something playful yet serious at the same time, which made me nervous but also fascinated. Isabel walked over to the stove, grabbing a glass from the cabinet before filling it with water. She moved slowly and deliberately as if she knew I was watching her. And I was. There was something about the way she moved, the way her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and the way her lips curved into a small, knowing smile that made it hard to look away. "What are you doing in here all alone?" she asked, taking a sip from her glass before leaning against the counter. Isabel tilted her head, her smile widening just a fraction. "I don't know why you've been avoiding me." I blinked, surprised by her observation. I hadn't thought I was avoiding her, but maybe I was. It wasn't intentional, but the tension between us, whatever it was, had been growing, and I didn't know how to handle it. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. She raised an eyebrow, setting her glass down on the counter. I shuffled uneasily in my seat, unsure of how to react. The reality was that I had kept my distance from Izzy. I didn't know why exactly, but it felt like something had shifted between us, and I didn't know how to manage it. I didn't know whether it was just me or if she felt it as well, but anyway, I had been trying to ignore it. "I've just been busy," I muttered lamely, knowing it wasn't a great explanation. Isabel's smile widened as she approached, her eyes shining with something I couldn't quite place. "Busy, huh? Too busy to even talk to me?" There was a teasing lilt to her voice, but below it I could hear something else, something more serious. She wasn't just playing around. There was something real behind her words, something she wasn't saying out loud. "I'm not avoiding you, Izzy," I repeated, though my voice was now unsure. Took another step closer, her body only a few feet from mine. Now I could feel the tension in the room growing thicker. The air between us, my heart sped, and I swallowed hard, trying to preserve my composure. "I think you are," she whispered gently, her eyes searching mine, "but you don't have to." I blinked, taken aback by her words. The room felt smaller now, the space between us diminishing with every passing second. Isabel's presence was overwhelming, making it difficult to think properly. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," I said, but the words felt hollow. Izzy stepped even closer, her face inches from mine. I could feel the heat of her body radiating off her skin, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. This was my stepsister, someone I had lived with for 2 years, but in this moment she didn't feel like a sister. She felt like something else entirely. "You don't have to pretend," Isabel muttered, barely audible. "I know you felt it too." I stiffened, my breath catching in my throat as her words sank in. She was right. I had felt it. The tension, the unspoken connection that had been simmering between us for weeks. I had tried to ignore it, to convince myself it wasn't real, but now that she was standing so close with her eyes locked on mine, there was no denying it anymore. I started, but my voice trailed off, unable to form a coherent thought. Izzy's hand moved, then reached out to softly brush against my arm. The contact was light and barely there, yet it shot a charge of electricity through me, making my pulse race even faster. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her lips twisting into a faint, knowing smile. Before I could react, Izzy moved in, her lips brushing softly against my cheek. The gesture was simple and almost innocent, but it put every nerve in my body on fire. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think, as the truth of what was occurring finally hit me. This wasn't just in my head. This wasn't just some unspoken tension that I had imagined. Izzy felt it as well, and now there was no going back. I stood there, frozen. Isabel's lips brushed against my cheek. It wasn't a full kiss, but rather a tease, a hint of something deeper, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin and the gentle pressure of her lips lingering in the air between us. "Isabel," I whispered, barely audible. I didn't even know what I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to push her away to end this before it went any further. But another part of me, the part one had been trying to ignore, wanted her to stay close to see where this was going. She didn't move. Instead, she smiled, that same soft, knowing smile that made my heart race. "What?" she asked innocently, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But the tension between us was undeniable now, crackling like static electricity. My head was spinning as I tried to make sense of what was going on. This was Isabel, my stepsister. This was wrong, wasn't it? But then she moved again, stepping even closer. Her body brushing lightly against mine, I could feel the heat radiating from her skin and the softness of her touch as she reached up and placed her hand gently on my chest. My breath hitched, and I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. Confusion, excitement, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. "Who says we can't?" she murmured. Her eyes locked on mine. There was a challenge in her gaze. A question. I gulped hard, trying to clear my brain, but it was impossible to think straight with her so near, with her touch sending shock waves through my entire body. "You know why?" I murmured, though my voice was wobbly and uncertain. Isabel's hand glided down my chest, her fingertips tracing a slow, purposeful trail that made my heart race faster. She asked softly, her lips curving into a playful smile, "Because it seems to me like you've been wanting this just as much as I have." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stiffened, my mind reeling. Was she right? Had I wanted this all along? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a surge of guilt rise up inside me. But at the same time, there was something else, something stronger. A part of me had been waiting for this moment, had been craving it. Izzy took another step closer, her body now pressed fully against mine, and I could feel the rapid beat of her heart through her chest. Her eyes were intense, filled with a mix of desire and curiosity, and it made it impossible to look away. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered, her hands sliding up to rest on the side of my neck, her thumb brushing lightly against my jaw. "You don't have to pretend anymore." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, like the world had tilted off its axis and I was spinning out of control. Everything about this felt wrong, but at the same time it felt so right, like we had been heading toward this moment for a long time, even if neither of us had been willing to admit it. "Isabel, this is what I tried again," but my voice faltered. She shook her head, silencing me with the softest of touches, her fingers brushing against my lips. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice steady. "You don't have to say anything." And then, before I could stop her, Isabel leaned in, her pressing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and electric. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if she was giving me a chance to pull away, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself kissing her back, my hands instinctively moving to her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened slowly and deliberately, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me, spreading like wildfire. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, every inch of my skin buzzing with the intensity of the moment. Isabel's hands slipped up to tangle in my hair, and her body pressed against mine, making it difficult to breathe. This was real, and I didn't want it to stop. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. The world seemed to blur around us, and for a moment, Nothing else mattered except the two of us standing there in the kitchen caught up in something neither of us had seen coming. I whispered, my voice unsteady and full of incredulity. Izzy smiled a soft, almost mischievous smile as she looked up at me. What does it feel like? I swallowed hard, my mind still racing. I didn't know how to answer that. It felt like everything had just shifted, like the tension that had been simmering between us for weeks had finally boiled over. But it also felt like there was no going back now, no way to undo what had just happened. I don't know, I admitted quietly, my hands still resting on her waist. But we can't do this. Her comments sent a rush of perplexity and desire through me, and I felt my stomach twist. This had to be wrong. But the way she was looking at me, the way she had kissed me, it made everything feel so real and unmistakable. I mean, you're my stepsister. I said it weakly, but even as I said it, it felt more like an excuse than a reason. Isabel lifted an eyebrow, her grin returning. So what? She questioned, her voice soft but persistent. We're not related by blood. We're just two people. Don't let that stop you. Her logic made my mind spin. Technically, she was right. We weren't blood relatives. We were just connected by our parents' marriage. Yet the weight of that truth still hung over me like a gloomy cloud. What about them? What about Dad and Victoria? I asked in a scarcely audible voice. Izzy's smile faded, and she quietly stepped back just enough to create a little space between us. I don't know what she said. Her voice is quiet, but I know that I don't want to pretend that nothing is happening between us anymore. Her words hit me hard, and I felt a wave of emotions rise up inside me. Guilt, confusion, and something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. She was right. We couldn't keep pretending the tension between us had been building for too long, and now that it had finally come to a head, there was no going back. But what were we supposed to do now? I don't know if we can just ignore this, I said quietly, my mind still spinning. Izzy nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at me. We don't have to figure everything out right now, she said gently. We can take it one step at a time. Her words brought a strange sense of calm to the storm that had been raging inside me. She was right. We didn't have to have all the answers right away. We just had to be honest with ourselves and with each other about what was going on. I took a deep breath, festetti. Tension in my chest start to ease. Okay, I said softly. Isabel smiled, a genuine smile this time, and the sight of it made my heart swell. We'll figure it out, she said quietly together. And in that moment, I believed her, but the story wasn't over yet. The days after that moment in the kitchen passed in a haze, and the tension between Isabel and me only seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't just the memory of the kiss or the way her touch had set my nerves on fire. It was the fact that we both knew we had crossed a line. We were in the same room. The air felt charged with something unspoken, something electric. Every glance, every accidental touch, sent my heart racing, and I could see the same intensity in Isabel's eyes. It was like a magnet pulling us toward each other, even though we both knew it was dangerous. One evening, about a week after that moment in the kitchen, I found myself sitting on the couch in the living room trying to focus on the TV, but my mind kept wandering. I could hear Isabel moving around in the kitchen, the sound of plates clinking and cabinets closing as she cleaned up after dinner. My dad and Victoria were out again, probably at some dinner party, leaving the house empty except for the two of us. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and my thoughts were louder than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about Izzy, about the way she had looked at me, the way her lips had felt against mine, and the way her touch had lingered long after she'd pulled away. Every moment alone with her was filled with an undercurrent of tension, and the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became just as I was about to get up and head to my room. Isabel arrived at the living room doorway wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there for a moment, her eyes locking onto mine. The sight on her face sent shivers down my spine, and I felt my pulse. "Quicken, you okay?" she murmured, her voice sweet but laced with something I couldn't place. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Yeah, just thinking." Isabel walked into the room, tossing the dish towel onto a nearby chair before sitting down on the edge of the couch, just a few feet away from me. The air between us crackled with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "What about?" she asked, her eyes searching for mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, I had been thinking about her, about us, ever since that night in the kitchen, but I didn't know. Isabel nodded, her gaze still fixed on me. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hanging heavily in the air. I could feel the pull between us, the magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second, and I knew that if I didn't get up and walk away now, things were about to escalate in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for, but I didn't move instead. I found myself leaning toward her, drawn by an I whispered, my voice shaking. Isabel gave a faint, knowing smile that made my heart race. "We're taking it slow," she added gently, "but that doesn't mean we can ignore what's going on." Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Isabel met me halfway, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative just like the first time. But this time there was no hesitation, no guilt, just the two of us finally giving in to the tension that had been building for weeks. The kiss deepened slowly and deliberately, and I felt Izzy's hand slide up to rest on the back of my neck, pulling, breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we attempted to recover our breath. The world began to blur around us, and for a time it felt like we were the only two people in the universe. "We should definitely stop," I muttered quietly, but I didn't really mean it. My hands were still around her waist, and I didn't want to let go. Isabel smiled, her fingers gently brushing the side of my face. "Do you really want to stop?" I hesitated, my heart racing. "I don't know. I just don't want to mess things up." She sighed softly, her forehead still resting against mine. "I get it, but maybe we're not messing anything up. Maybe we're just figuring things out." Her words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't help but think she was right. This didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like something that had been building for a long time, something that was finally finding its way to the surface. "I don't know what we're supposed to do," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. Izzy re-leans into it, "But I know," she said, and then at that moment I couldn't hold it anymore, and she noticed, and so she kissed me with passion, and we both let ourselves go. Felt amazing. I didn't realize what was going on. Isabel and I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Every glance, touch, and moment alone held a weight that we both felt but didn't completely accept. We didn't talk about what had happened between us, but the connection was always there, irrefutable and impossible to ignore. I tried to go about my routine as normally as possible, but it felt like everything had changed. I was hyper-aware of Isabel's presence in the house, the way her footsteps sounded as she moved around, and the way her eyes seemed to follow me whenever we were in the same room. It was as if the air itself had thickened, making every interaction between us feel charged with something unspoken. One evening, about a week after that second kiss, we found ourselves alone in the house again. I was sitting at the kitchen table flipping through a magazine I wasn't really reading, trying to distract myself from the tension that seemed to be building with each passing second. Izzy strolled into the kitchen, her motions slow and deliberate, and I felt my pulse. As she sat across from me, the room was dimly lit, with the only light coming from the overhead lamp above the table casting soft shadows across her face. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on me, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. I laid the magazine down, my heart beating. I had been dreading this conversation even though I knew it was unavoidable. We couldn't keep pretending like nothing had happened. We couldn't keep ignoring the elephant in the room. "Yes," I said, my voice unsteady. "I suppose we do." Isabel leaned forward, her hands Izzy pressed together on the table in front of her for a time. She didn't say anything. She just gazed at me as if trying to figure out how to begin. The quiet between us was heavy, almost stifling, and I could feel the weight of all we hadn't said crushing down.